Dear colleagues, it is the 30th of August 2015. This is the best time in summer, and it is 5 p.m. On a Sunday afternoon, and I would like to thank you on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation to spare your time and attend our seminar. I would like to express my gratitude, and I would like to thank you for your contribution to this conference. Our topic today is global justice and human rights. Thomas Pogge is a professor at Yale University. Microphone. 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 Well, we have had about 70 conferences on many topics. We had 10-15 conferences organized together with SODEV, and the basic topic that we discussed was peace, freedom, and human rights. During all this time, when we look at the present situation in Turkey, we can say that we have not made any progress at all. Obviously, much has changed during the course of the years, but all those changes that we accomplished, when we compare it to the present situation in the world, is not encouraging. The most fundamental of human rights is the right to life. And next comes freedom of expression, and then freedom of association. Unfortunately, during the whole history of the Turkish Republic, on the topic of these fundamental human rights, we always had some certain things missing, and there were always reasonings, justifications to explain the present situation. Sometimes it was the national security that was set forth as an explanation, or any other reason. All these rights were limited, and the Turkish people had to endure many sacrifices. We never had a dull life. We always had an interesting time, one after the other. There were times when 5 to 10 people died daily. The final score was 20 people who died. Now a few people, 2, 3, 4 people die daily, and we continue our daily lives as if nothing is happening. And this is very dangerous, because we are becoming aliens towards each other. Well, we wanted to become part of the European Union, because on the one hand we are in the NATO, and we are in the international institutions, but in certain cases we can see in situations like a prohibition of entering a specific area. We don't know what the Turkish army is doing at certain parts of Turkey, and the PKK, the fighters for the freedom of the Kurdish people, and although Abdullah Öcalan in his final last statement stated that the time for armed confrontation should be over, but still this is not being realized, and we still have situations where and actions where the right to life is jeopardized in our country. There can be no justification for death, regardless of who is killing whom or who is causing the deaths. The person who is doing, or the entity doing this, is a murderer, be it a murderer as a human being or a state organization. Well, I do not want to dwell too long on these issues. Our guest speaker is a philosopher on global justice and human rights, and he is a very important name at international level. And I think that it will give us a great pleasure to listen to him. And I would like to thank Ayşen Candaş, who made great contributions to the organization of this conference. I would like to thank her and also to other colleagues. I would like to give the floor to Ayşen Candaş as our moderator now. Hello, welcome all. We shall leave the present domestic conditions in Turkey, and we shall be dwelling on international injustices and their remedies today. And we are here to I'm here to introduce an internationally known person. First of all, I would like to thank the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and TÜSES for realizing this organization. And this is how we can listen to Thomas Pogge today. Thomas Pogge is a German philosopher. However, he had his doctorate completed at the United States of America. He worked at the Philosophy and Political Science Department of Columbia University, and then he joined the Yale University, and in the last 10 years he is there, and he is the director of Global Justice Program. And he also is lecturer at institutions like the King's College in London and at the Oslo University. He is a person who should be referred to by many students on philosophical concepts, and he is a member of Stanford Philosophy. He is an editor of the Stanford Philosophy Encyclopedia, and he is a member of the Norwegian Science Academy. And he is also the president of the international network called Academic Stand Against Poverty. He is also leading. The network called Incentives for Global Health. He is the founder, which is again aiming in recent years to regulate the access to medicine produced with the recent technology. At the Harvard University, he also worked on social justice issue together with Professor John Rawls. He was the thesis consultant of Pogge. Pogge has had many publications on the philosophy of Rawls and also of Immanuel Kant. But Pogge does not deal with the topic of social justice issue only on the basis of factual, on its factual side, but also by the scientific properties. And he tries to present us the big difference between what is being done and what needs to be done. Global justice issue has been underlined firstly by him, and he has many books and articles on this issue. Mentioning a few of those, first of all, he has introduced the concept of global justice to the world literature. John Rawls and Justice Theory, his Life and Theory of Justice, Oxford 2007. Poverty and Human Rights in the Whole World, or Politics as Usual, and the rhetoric which seems to support the poor. And if we were to summarize the problematics which on which his work is based to, I can say the following. Pogge states that 1/3 of human death is related to poverty. In the entire world, annually 18 million people die because of poverty-related reasons, and 12 million of these people are children younger than 5 years of age. And Pogge has had many studies in order to underline these issues, and recently he has dwelled upon the statistical methods in order to differentiate who are and who the poor and what is poverty. But he has published a recent book on the real meaning of the poor and the poverty. And he has dwelled upon the factual properties of poverty, and in order to underline the quality and quantity of the poverty. Professor Pogge mentioned always what is urgent and which is the most systematic human rights violations and lack of justice. For instance, producing acquiring new patent rights, and however buying them later on, and producing the medicines at a very low price. Obviously, he considers all this major human rights violations, and he is our professor. We have learned many realities from him, and before talking too long, I would like to give the floor immediately to Professor Pogge.
And I will indeed today talk about human rights in a different context from the one that most of you will be familiar with, simply because there is so much going on in Turkey these days that is relevant to human rights. Essentially, as I see it, one can think of human rights problems as falling into 4 categories, and you can develop these 4 categories by making 2 cross-cutting distinctions. There are the domestic problems and the international problems, and then there are the human rights violations that we actively commit and the human rights problems that we could alleviate. And I will focus on the human rights problems that are international and ones that we actively commit. And we do that often by participating in global rule-making and rule enforcement actions that foreseeably and avoidably lead to human rights deficits. So that's roughly the area in which I will be speaking. So institutions are the rules of the game, the rules that govern a particular social system, for example, a country or a larger entity, like in the limit, the world at large. Globalization has given us rules that have global scope. For example, the rules of the World Trade Organization and of also the rules of international politics and diplomacy. So justice, as we conceive of it, or social justice, as you might say, concerns the normative assessment of these kinds of systems of rules. So we talk about rules or systems of rules as being more or less just, rules at the national level or also rules at the supranational level. And we might then say that, well, what exactly is justice? How do we assess these rules? And here, human rights present a very good first step. Obviously, there's disagreement in the world about what an appropriate conception of justice is, how we should judge rules of a social system. But I think most people can agree that a minimal condition for the justice of rules is that these rules have to be human rights compliant. That means that the rules have to be so designed that they do not give rise to avoidable human rights deficits. When rules give rise to avoidable human rights deficits, then they are unjust. Now, the fact that they do not is not sufficient for justice, but it's a necessary condition for justice. For example, rules may give rise to a lot of inequality, and they may be unjust for that reason, even if they do not give rise to avoidable human rights deficits. But at the minimum, they have to be human rights compliant, or that's the idea. And that's widely accepted these days. Human rights are a standard that countries have accepted, that is widely taken for granted in the United Nations and so on. And so it seems a good starting point for an analysis of our existing international order. And it's also something that is explicitly articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was the big founding document of the human rights movement in 1948. You see there in Article 28, it says everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. So what this means is that human rights have not only the function to constrain governments in their conduct, but they also have the function to give certain standards that social rules must meet. Every social order, every international order should be such that the rights and freedoms in this declaration, our human rights, can be realized in that order. So Turkey should be so organized, its rules should be such that the human rights of the Turkish people are secure. And similarly, the world should be organized in such a way that the human rights of people everywhere in the world are secure, insofar, of course, as that is possible. So I start with a recapitulation of how human rights are understood within the UN system. So the UN system thinks of human rights as primarily addressed to states. States are the main addressees. They are the ones who have the responsibility to comply with human rights. And states are given three duties in particular. They have negative duties to respect human rights. And by negative duties, I should explain, that's a philosophical term. And negative duties are duties that you can fulfill without doing anything. So the duty not to kill somebody else, I can fulfill that duty by sitting on the chair and doing nothing. That's a negative duty. A positive duty is a duty that requires me to do something actively. For example, the duty to assist people in danger of death is a duty that requires that I get up from my chair and I go to the water and get the child out of the water. So we have negative duties to respect human rights. That means not to torture, not to take away people's freedom of expression, not to kill people, and so on. These negative duties. Then we have positive duties to protect human rights. So, for example, the state has to maintain police forces and a court system to protect people from potential violations of human rights by criminals or terrorists and so forth. And finally, we have positive duties to fulfill human rights, by which the United Nations means in particular natural catastrophes and things like that, so floods or earthquakes. And later, they differentiated that out into duties to provide. So, for example, to give food aid in situations of a natural disaster, and duties to facilitate, which means that we should anticipate possible problems and try to prevent their occurrence. So if we know that there could be a tsunami, then we should have early warning stations, make sure that the population is informed. Rather than wait for the tsunami to happen and then to provide aid, we should try to protect the population in advance. Now, what I want to add to the United Nations thinking about human rights is a few points that I want to go through. The first one is that I think we should make a similar distinction on the part of negative duties to the distinction I just introduced with regard to duties to fulfill. So we should say that there are two different ways in which a state can violate the human rights of its members. On the one hand, it can do so through actions, for example, by unjustly imprisoning somebody and torturing a prisoner, and it can do so through rules, for example, by having an economic order under which some people predictably starve to death, cannot feed their children, and so on. So a state can actively violate human rights through actions that it takes and also through rules that it imposes, interactionally and institutionally. So that's the same distinction, or the analogous distinction to the distinction between providing and facilitating. Providing is an action, and facilitating is to create institutions that anticipate and protect people from disasters. Secondly, I think that we should also, with regard to the negative duties, pay less attention to the distinction between insiders and outsiders. So with negative duties, there isn't that strong priority for compatriots that the United Nations is presuming. The United Nations is basically saying that every state, every government should take care of the human rights of its own citizens, first and foremost. And that is plausible with regard to positive duties. The government of Turkey has stronger reasons to provide and fulfill and protect for the human rights of Turkish citizens than for the human rights of, let's say, Nigerian citizens. But when it comes to negative duties to respect, the difference is very small or non-existent. So if a government violates human rights, actively does something to make the human rights of others be unfulfilled, then it doesn't matter very much whether these are insiders or outsiders. So I want to give you a simple example. Suppose that I teach and some student comes to me and tells me about his vacation. He went on vacation, and I ask him, how was your vacation? And he says, well, it was okay, but I had one big problem. The problem was I had a party, I was drunk, and I drove with my car back to the hotel, and I killed a child on the way because I was so drunk. And then he smiles and he says, but it wasn't so bad because it happened in Mexico, and in Mexico there were no Turkish people, and so I didn't endanger any Turkish people. I endangered only Mexican people. Not a big deal. Now, we would disagree. We would say it is just as bad to drive drunk in Mexico, where you are endangering Mexican people, as it is to drive drunk in Anatolia, where you are endangering Turkish people. Right? So when you actively harm people, actively violate their rights, it doesn't make a big difference whether these are compatriots or foreigners. And the same, I think, holds for governments. when a government actively violates human rights, then it's just about as bad if it does it to compatriots as when it does it to foreigners. And this can happen institutionally at both the national level or the international level. So the Turkish government could be imposing rules that are violating the human rights of Turkish citizens by passing certain laws, and it could also participate in the violation of human rights of foreigners if it participates in the design or imposition of international rules that foreseeably harm foreigners. So that's the way in which my position takes off, but also goes beyond the United Nations thinking about human rights. So now I want to give you an argument about how we are responsible, co-responsible together with many others, for a very large human rights deficit that is presently in existence in the world. So the first step of the argument is that under the present rules of the world economy, the human rights of most people are unfulfilled. And I want to give you some statistics. These are official statistics from the different United Nations agencies. We are 7.3 billion people in the world today, and among them, very large numbers of people are still suffering human rights abridgments. They suffer deprivations that mean that their human rights are not fulfilled. You can see the numbers here. I should tell you these numbers are, for the most part, too low. The true numbers are much higher, but that's not something I will talk about in this lecture. I've criticized, as Aishan has said, I've criticized these numbers, and these numbers are, as I said, too low, but for today we can just take these numbers at face value. Even if they're accurate, you can see half the people in the world are still suffering from very severe deprivations that mean their human rights are unfulfilled. And these are all deprivations of poverty. These are all related to poverty. And as Aishan already mentioned, about 1/3 of all deaths in the world, every day, every week, every year, are from poverty-related causes. And these are the causes here. This is a conservative estimate because I list all the causes of death that are concentrated among the poor. So diarrhea, for example. In rich countries, nobody dies from diarrhea. All the diarrhea deaths are in poor countries. And so we know it's a poverty-related kind of death. Now, of course, there are the ordinary causes of death that we also suffer, like diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and so on. And very often, poor people die from these causes at a much younger age than we, because they have very bad medical care and greater environmental challenges. But I have not counted any of those deaths as poverty-related. So I've done a conservative accounting, only counting those causes of death that clearly are concentrated among the poor. And even then, you get to 18 million per year, and that's obviously a very large number, as you can see here. In the 25 years since the end of the Cold War, we had about 450 million poverty deaths, and in the entire 20th century, 100 years, we had only 200 million deaths from government violence, wars, civil wars, gulags, concentration camps, and so on. So poverty is a very, very big killer, 450 million in 25 years. And so I think I have proved to you that there is a very, very big human rights deficit in the world that is ongoing today. And so the human right that is least realized, that is most often unfulfilled, is this human right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of oneself and one's family. But we should also remember that many civil and political human rights remain unfulfilled for poor people. Poor people are often treated very badly with impunity because they do not have the means to defend themselves, the means to call the police, to get a lawyer, to go to court, and so on. Many domestic servants are abused, for example, by their employers. Many poor factory workers are harassed at the workplace, and so on and so forth. So that was the first premise, that more than half of all human beings in the world today do not have their human rights fulfilled. The second premise is that it's foreseeable that most of this human rights deficit would be reasonably avoidable with an alternative design of the global rules. So we could have designed the rules of the global system in such a way that this human rights deficit would not occur, or it would not be anywhere near as large as it is. And the first way to appreciate that is just to look at the global income distribution. So here you see on the screen how income is distributed in the world. The top 5% of the world's population have 43% of the income. The next 20% have another 42%. So 85% of global income goes just to the top quarter. And that leaves 15% for the rest, and about 4% only goes to the lower half. And so intuitively, you can already see if the bottom half, if the poorer half, instead of getting 4%, if they got 7%, the whole problem of severe hunger and disease and so on would be solved, right? They would have almost twice as much income, and it would be very easy to redesign the world economy in such a way that the bottom half of the human population has 7% rather than 4%. So just the income distribution tells you that it's very likely possible to redesign the world economy to avoid these enormous human rights violations. You can do the same exercise for wealth. Wealth is even more unequally distributed than income. And one thing that we will not celebrate this year, but it will happen this year, is that for the first time in human history, the richest 1% of the world's population will have more than half of all private wealth in the world. This is an anniversary or something that is uncelebrated, because of course it's a little bit embarrassing, but it is happening, as Oxfam is quite eager to point out. Now, if you take the wealth of the bottom half of the human population, the poorest half of humanity, their wealth is 0.6% of all the private wealth in the world. So half the human beings have only 0.6%. Now, if you take from the top, from the richest people, if you take some people from the top, how many percent of the world's population do you need to have the same amount of wealth as the bottom half have? Make a guess, and then I will tell you. Make a guess in your mind. So the answer, you have a guess? The answer is you need only 66 people. The richest 66 individual people have as much wealth as the lower half of humanity, of all human beings. 3.65 billion people. Now, in response to this critique of the status quo, people often make two arguments, and I want to go through these arguments. The first argument is, but we have made so much progress, we have lifted so many people out of poverty. And the Millennium Development Goals, which are expiring this year, are supposed to make you think that way. They're supposed to make you feel good about the world. You say, in 1990, there were so many more poor people, and now it's better than it was. So there has been progress, and isn't that wonderful? Shouldn't we celebrate? And it's true that the percentages of poor people have been going down. The absolute numbers, it's disputed. I think the number of hungry people is actually higher today than it was in 1990. But as we all know, inequality has increased, and so the poor people of the world have not participated proportionately in global economic growth. They have not grown as fast as the world economy. But the most important thing is this, that the comparison with the past is really the morally less important comparison. To show that, I mean, think of an historical example. Think of slavery in 1840, and imagine somebody says, in defense of slavery, look, slavery was much worse in 1815, let's say. In 1815, slaves were whipped very, very often. In 1815, families of slaves were ripped apart. One was sold in this way, the other was sold that way. Slave girls were raped all the time. It was a terrible time. And today it's much better. People get whipped less often, families are separated less often, slave girls are raped less often. So what are you complaining about? What would we answer? We would say, slavery is now avoidable. Abolish it. It doesn't matter that it was even worse in 1815. Today it's bad. Today it can be abolished, and it should be abolished. And that is what I want to say about poverty. I want to say that poverty today can be abolished, and it doesn't matter whether it was worse in 1990. Maybe it was, but today we can abolish it. Today we should abolish it. And the fact that it was worse in the past is no excuse. So the comparison that we should focus on is the comparison with what would now be possible, and not the comparison with what happened at an earlier time. And the whole MDG, SDG exercise, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, these are propaganda exercises that are meant to divert our attention to a historical comparison and away from a synchronic comparison between what's actual and what's now possible. So, speaking about the history one more time, what I want to say is that, of course, poverty has always been with us. Poverty has been worse in the past. But what is new about today's period, if we want to compare historically, is that for the first time in history, poverty today can be abolished very easily. We have enough technological, administrative, and economic capacity to eradicate poverty worldwide. And that's different between today's poverty and the poverty in the past. Never has there been so much avoidable poverty as there is today. And avoidable poverty is a human rights violation. Unavoidable poverty is not a human rights problem. If it's not avoidable, then it's not avoidable. Nobody is really responsible for it. But today, all the poverty in the world is avoidable, and so we are, or somebody at least, is responsible for it, and we ought to do our best to avoid it. Here's the second counter-argument. The second counter-argument addresses a slightly different point. It says that, okay, there is avoidable poverty, yes, but that avoidable poverty is the fault of local factors. Local factors such as geography or bad government, corruption, whatever. It's local factors. And you know I can prove that to you. I can prove that to you by looking at the different countries in the world and their development. So think of South Korea and Senegal. South Korea and Senegal, they were both very poor in 1955. And look today. Today, South Korea is rich. Nobody suffers human rights problems in South Korea. And Senegal is still poor. So they developed very differently. And so it must be local factors. It cannot be global factors, because the global factors were the same. The global factors made South Korea possible. And so it can't be the global order that causes poverty. The global order, global institutions have nothing to do with it. Now, this argument is very, very popular. It's so popular that The Economist magazine repeats it every week. You can read it in every Economist magazine issue. You'll find it somewhere. Anyway, I think it's a bad argument. It's a non sequitur. And a good way to bring that out is to give you an analogy. When I teach at Yale, at the end of the semester, some people have learned very much and other people have learned very little. Other students have learned very little. And so you can conclude that the teacher is irrelevant to the student's success or failure, right? It can't be the teacher. The teacher can have nothing to do with it. That's obviously a stupid argument, right? The teacher can have a lot to do with it. The teacher, through good teaching, can raise the success of all the students in the classroom. But the teacher can also affect who does well and who does poorly. So, for example, the teacher chooses the materials, chooses the teaching style, and depending on these choices, some students will thrive and others not. So I like to use a lot of charts and numbers, and the science students like it, and the humanities students are often a little bit scared. So if I use different teaching materials, maybe the humanities students would do better in my class, and the science students less well. And even some of the student-specific factors, like motivation, for example, are of course influenced by the teacher. So a teacher who makes sexist jokes will turn off some students who will not listen to him or maybe demotivated. And in that way, yes, there is a student-specific difference, but it plays a role. It acts only because of the teacher's characteristics. So the teacher certainly influences the student's performance in many ways, and differences in student performance in many ways, despite the fact that it's the same teacher for the whole class. And the same is true of our global economic rules. The global economic rules are maybe favorable for some countries and unfavorable for other countries, and if the rules were different, then the countries that are doing very poorly now would do better, and the countries that are doing very well now would do worse. So the fact that different countries thrive or fail to thrive differentially, that is not a good argument for concluding that the global rules play no role, are irrelevant to what happens in the various different countries. So what are the most important global rules that play a role in determining how countries are doing with regard to poverty? So these global rules act in two different ways. Some rules act directly on the populations of poor countries, and other rules act indirectly by influencing the national constitution, the national practices and rules of a country. So one example is protectionism. In the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the rich countries insisted on continuing to protect their markets, for example, in agriculture and in textiles, through quotas, tariffs, anti-dumping duties, export credits, subsidies, and so on. And all these protectionist measures, for which the rich countries spend about $300 billion every year, hurt the export opportunities of the poor countries. So that's one example where the continued protectionism that is forbidden to the poor countries is harming and increasing poverty in the poor countries. Intellectual property rights is another very big problem. Intellectual property rights were forced upon the poor countries as a condition of membership in the World Trade Organization, and they have made medicines much, much more expensive, new medicines that are patented. As a result, poor people cannot buy advanced medicines, and millions of people have died, and millions more have become sick and continue to be sick as a consequence of not being able to buy medicine that can be manufactured at very, very low prices. There are pollution rules, which basically are allowing the rich countries to pollute as much as they like without paying any compensation to the poor countries that suffer the impact. Already today, hundreds of thousands of people die every year from the consequences of greenhouse gases, heat waves, diseases spreading into new areas, floods, extreme weather events like storms, typhoons, and so on. And these are due to the pollution of rich countries, and they give no compensation to the poor populations that suffer the impact. There are illicit financial flows. The many rich countries have organized themselves in such a way that their companies can avoid paying taxes in poor countries. Multinational corporations routinely pay no taxes in poor countries, and even rich people who are citizens in these poor countries routinely find ways to put their money into rich Western bank accounts, countries' bank accounts, where they can avoid taxes, in Switzerland, in Singapore, in the Bahamas, Bermudas, Cayman Islands, and so forth. There are 77 tax havens where you can put your money, and the US and the UK are two of those tax havens. Then there are the resource privileges. This is, again, resource and borrowing privileges. That's a very major and very detrimental part of our global order. We recognize any person or group that exercises effective power in a country as the legitimate government of that country, and we pay that person or group for the resources that we import from that country. So take an example, the Nigerian dictator Sani Abacha. He was dictator because he had a lot of money, a lot of weapons, a lot of soldiers. And who gave him the money? We did. We paid him for the oil that he sold to us, but it wasn't his oil. It was the oil of the Nigerian people who had never elected him. He was just a dictator, just a guy who got to power through a coup d'etat. And that, of course, is routine. Pretty much all the oil countries, pretty much all the resource-rich countries are undemocratic countries where an unelected government maintains power thanks to our paying them for resources and our lending them money. The arms trade is another disaster where we ship large quantities of small arms into developing countries. And of course, these arms are used almost exclusively for bad purposes, for civil wars, for government repression, and so on. And all the cruelties that you see on the television in the Congo, for example, are committed with weapons that get shipped in from the wealthy countries. And finally, labor standards. That's a peculiar exception similar to pollution rules. In some areas, the rich countries insist on very precise rules. Everybody must abide by certain rules. Intellectual property must be protected. But in other areas, the rich countries don't want rules. They don't want common labor standards. They want the poor countries to compete against each other in offering exploitable, maltreatable, abusable workforces. And they don't want pollution rules, again, because they want to be free to pollute as much as they like. So these are examples of parts of our international rule system, of our global institutional architecture, that show that this architecture is designed in a way that is beneficial to the rich countries and their most privileged constituents, and designed to be, as a side effect, to be hostile to the poor, hostile to development. Now, why is that happening? Why are these rules so friendly to the rich and so unfriendly to the poor? Well, again, the answer is pretty obvious. The answer is that the rich can exert more political influence on designing these rules than the poor. And so you get what's called regulatory capture. You know, everybody tries to influence the rules in their own favor, and the rich and those who already have political influence are much better able to do that than the poor. And that leads to a kind of inequality spiral where the richest and best connected shape the rules in their own favor. That makes them even richer and even more powerful, even more able, again, to influence the rules. And so in each round, the rich become richer and more influential, and the poor become more marginalized. Now, this is a very old phenomenon. Regulatory capture goes back as long as there is political rule in the world. But what is new now, in the last 25 years, is this phenomenon of globalization. Rulemaking has shifted upward from the national level to the global level or the supranational level. More and more rules are made above the level of the nation state. And that means that these rulemakings, these rule decisions, are taken out of the hands of ordinary people and put into the hands of a very small elite of politicians and those who can influence these politicians. So if you look at the TTIP, for example, various kinds of trade agreements that are now being negotiated, there is no democracy here. There is no democratic counterweight. Ordinary citizens don't really understand what's being negotiated, and most importantly, they have no real way of influencing what is being decided about the rules. There's very little transparency, right? In a normal democracy, the laws that the government proposes are published, and everybody can read them, and people can protest or discuss them before they are adopted. But with international rules, people are not informed. People don't know what is being negotiated behind closed doors. And you learn the negotiation result only when the negotiation has already concluded and the states have already agreed. Then you are told what they have agreed upon. And the international sphere is also special in that it's much easier to dismiss moral constraints. So if somebody says about international rules, but these rules are immoral, they are very bad for poor people in Africa, then the answer is, we are sorry, but in the international realm, it's a jungle. We are fighting against the Chinese, against the Russians, and we cannot pay attention to morality in this competition. We have to be fighting very hard for our interests, because in the long run, we can survive and prevail against the Chinese and the Russians only if we are tough, only if we are very selfish in this international competition. That's the argument. And of course, the Chinese say the same thing. They say, we would love to do something good for Africa, but we are competing with the Americans, and they're evil, and so we need to be very selfish in our competition with the Americans. We have to fight for the rules that are best for maximizing Chinese power. We cannot pay attention to the poor people of Africa. So, because of these factors, if you are a big company or a billionaire, the best thing you can do to maximize your power is to try to lobby, to try to influence rulemaking, not in the country, but above the country, international rulemaking. That is the big domain where the big, rich corporations, hedge funds, banks, billionaires, where they now exert their influence. They spend a lot of money, a lot of attention, a lot of effort on influencing international rulemaking, lobbying for rules that are good for themselves, because you can lobby much more effectively at the international level than at the national level. And I think that has been one big driver of increasing inequality all over the world, because the richest, most powerful agents have managed to influence that international rulemaking. So what they try to do is shift rulemaking from the national level, where it's difficult to influence, up to the supranational level, where it's easier to influence, and then, of course, to shape the rules in their own favor. And here, yeah, I should say, here the US government is the venue of choice for two reasons. The US government is the strongest negotiator in international rule shaping. And secondly, the US government is the most for sale. You can most easily buy the US government. We now have an election, as you know, and billions and billions of dollars are being collected by politicians. Everybody who wants to win has to collect a lot of money to win. And so it's an almost official system of bribery, where people collect money and say, please give me money, and I will pay you with favors. I will do good things for you. So we have a democracy in America that is a $1, one vote democracy, where dollars really count. And so if you want to influence global rulemaking, don't waste your money on the government of Turkey or France. Try to influence the US government. And those who are able to do that are making the greatest gains, are benefiting the most from lobbying. So here's one example where a company, a research company, has found a good way to make money in the American stock market. Their idea is the 500 largest companies of the US, you always invest, not in the whole 500, but you invest in those 50 companies that spend the most money on lobbying. So every quarter you determine who is spending the most money on lobbying relative to their assets, and that's where I invest my money. And if you do that, look how much better you do. This is an 11-year period, and in these 11 years, if you invest in the whole S&P 500, you have made no money at all because of 2008, right? Zero. You have no gain at all. If you invest in the 50 companies that spend the most money on lobbying, you have a very big gain, 250% up this line. So this is the S&P 500, and this is the 50 companies that spend the most money on lobbying. So lobbying really works. And to prove that, I give you one other example. This is an example of one law that was passed in 2004. It's called the Americans Job Creation Act. And of course, it didn't create any jobs, but American laws always have nice propaganda names. So the American Job Creation Act was a tax holiday. A tax holiday is a period, a short period, in which a certain tax is reduced as a favor. So this was a tax to repatriate money that had accumulated in tax havens. American companies put a lot of money into tax havens, where basically they cheat on the taxes in the poor countries. They make transactions between a subsidiary in a poor country and a subsidiary in a tax haven that is unfavorable for the subsidiary in the poor country. So that subsidiary loses money and so doesn't have to pay taxes because it has no profit. And the profit is shifted into a tax haven where there is no tax on profit. So American companies have accumulated huge amounts of money in these tax havens that has never been taxed. But if you bring that money home to America, you have to pay 35% taxes. And so these companies said, we don't want to pay 35% taxes. We would like to bring the money home at a reduced rate. And so they got a tax holiday, a short period, where they get an 85% discount on their taxes. So instead of paying 35%, they paid 5.25%, much cheaper. Now, these economists, they went through public records to find how much money these firms paid to get the law. They had to go to congresspeople and pay these congresspeople to pass the law. But afterwards, they got a lot of money because they saved on their taxes. And so it turned out that for every $1 that these companies paid to get the law passed, paid for lobbying, they saved $221 in taxes. That's a pretty good profit. For every dollar that you invest, you get $221 back. So that's how lobbying works. You buy yourself a law that pays you a huge amount of money, saves a huge amount of money for you through lobbying. And you can see here the result of the lobbying that was possible in the globalization period, that especially the people at the very top of the American income hierarchy, they have benefited the most. And let's look at it on the next thing. So this is the top 0.01% of the US income distribution. These are about 30,000 people. It's 14,000 tax returns. And these people have increased their share of national income from 0.86% in 1978 to 6.04% in 2007. So it's a 7 times increase in their share. This is just 14,000 people who have 6% of income in the United States in 2007. It may be a little bit more now. So the people at the top have gained tremendously. What's interesting is that income inequality has fallen for 50 years between 1928 and 1978, and then it bottomed out and rose, first through the Reagan-Thatcher years, but then through globalization. And now we have a steadily rising income inequality with especially the very, very rich, not the top 10%, not the top 1%, the top 10th of 1%, the top 100th of 1%, really gaining tremendously. So what I'm saying then is, at the international level, we find that international law consists of two different parts that are divided, that are hostile to each other. On the one side, we have the Sunday part of international law, the beautiful words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the covenants, and so on. Every human being has a right to this and a right to that. Wonderful language. On the other hand, we have international law governing trade, governing finance, labor, and that international law, the more business, economic international law, is deeply unjust, it is for sale, and it destroys, systematically destroys, the human rights that are asserted in the Sunday part. And of course, our propagandists are always pointing at the Sunday part and saying how beautiful international law is, by neglecting the other part that is systematically destroying the ambitions of the first part. So I will shorten this to get to the end relatively quickly. So the conclusion of the first step was basically to say that the existing international order is highly unjust. That's the first premise of the second step of the argument. And then the argument goes on just to say that whose responsibility is that? It is the responsibility of the more powerful countries, and especially governments, that are negotiating these rules and imposing them, implementing them worldwide. And so the governments of the more powerful states collectively are responsible for designing and imposing this unjust order. And the responsibility for that, in turn, lies with individuals, with the citizens in these countries who bear responsibility for what their government does in their name. And in conclusion, I want to say then we have, with regard to this human rights deficit, this global human rights deficit, as citizens, two responsibilities. One responsibility is to work for reform, to try to oppose the relentless imposition of unjust rules at the global level. And insofar as we are unable to do that, together with others by mobilizing politically, we have a responsibility at least to compensate for our fair share of the harm that, together with many other citizens of powerful countries, we do through our role in imposing these unjust rules. So that's the sketch of the argument, and I look forward to a good discussion. Thank you.